During the existence of Unit 731, Japanese doctors performed experiments on thousands of people, ultimately killing potentially up to 300,000 or 400,000 individuals in the surrounding areas and in their laboratories. They dissected many while still alive, including infants and pregnant women, and also injected them with biological weapons agents or other pathogens. My mother was one of the rare survivors, a witness to the horrors of those events. She lived in a town about 50 miles from Manchukuo, the base for Unit 731. She remembered the date when the soldiers and doctors entered her life and took away everything she knew and loved. September 1st, 1942. This is the account of those hellish events she shared with me before she died. The ceramic bomb fell slowly from the sky, spinning in lazy circles before righting itself and coming straight down toward our town. A single white plane with the symbol of the rising sun whined past the center of town, flying away like a criminal escaping the scene of a crime. A couple of merchants came out of their shops, looking up into the sky with suspicion and fear. I saw the bomb hit the yard behind my neighbor's home. It shattered into millions of pieces, a sound like smashing glass shattering the silence. I was very small at the time, only 5 or 6 years old. I ran inside to tell my mother. I saw her standing behind the fireplace, cooking a small batch of tea, waiting for my father to come home. "Mother, a Japanese plane just flew over the town and it dropped a bomb. But it looked like it was ceramic and it didn't even blow up. Why do you think they did this?" My mother's face paled visibly. "Stay inside," she ordered me, turning to look out the window, her eyes filled with fear and anxiety as she continuously searched for my father's silhouette on the trail leading up to the front door. "Where is your father? I wish he was here with us." She poured herself a cup of plain green tea, sipping the steaming beverage and refusing to meet my gaze. She just continued to watch the road. And it was then that the first pangs started, a sense of wrongness and foreboding filling my mind. My mother and I stayed inside the rest of the day, waiting for my father. She grew increasingly worried as the hours passed, but she wouldn't allow me to go outside to look for him. I ended up sitting next to my mother and pouring myself a cup of tea. She suddenly grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight and looking me in the face for the first time. "Something bad is going to happen, I think," she said. "Or maybe it's happening already. No matter what, I want you to know I love you. I love you as only a mother can love her only child." These words only increased my sense of dread, and I didn't know what to say. My eyes watered and I felt like I might start crying. My mother had never been so explicitly and openly emotional like this before. "I love you too, you know that," I said, trying to force a smile. My mother didn't return it. She just went back to staring outside at the dying day. Finally, around dark, my father came running up to the house, his face covered in sweat. He flung the door open, running right past me without even looking at me. "We need to leave the town immediately," he said to my mother, tears streaming down his face. "I think it's too late, but we need to try." "What's wrong?" my mother asked. "Did you see what the Japanese left us?" My father shook his head, closing his eyes. "The neighbors and I went to look at the so-called bomb that dropped from the sky," he said, his voice quickening and rising as he spoke. "What we found—" "Why would you go out there?" my mother asked. My father continued to keep his eyes closed, refusing to meet her gaze. "We found dead fleas inside a massive shattered ceramic shell," he said. "Thousands of them, some smashed flat from the impact. And all around the area, tens of thousands of live ones, very active. They were jumping around like crazy. I got bitten quite a few times." He paused for a long moment, his face still troubled and pale. I stood up and started laughing. Fleas? Father, why would you be scared of fleas? I asked. That's much better than them dropping a real bomb. We've had flea bites before. That's not such a horrible thing, is it? My mother and father looked scared, but I couldn't understand why. We fled that night, packing our bags within minutes. We went to the next town over and stayed with my mother's parents. But after a few days passed, our family discovered we hadn't gone nearly far enough. My grandmother came in on the third day after what I jokingly called the flea bomb attack, holding a basket of goods from the local market. She complained that her head was pounding and her stomach hurt. My mother felt her forehead, exclaiming that my grandmother had a high fever. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing," my grandmother responded, flipping a hand as if she was shooing away a fly. "Probably just something I ate. I've survived much worse than a little stomach ache, I can tell you that." She winked at me, showing off her toothless gums as she smiled. Within hours of her falling ill, countless others began showing symptoms. Like falling dominoes, the sickness spread through the entire village, swarming the countryside with its black, fetid rot. It started with headaches, stomach pains, fever, diarrhea, chills, and sweating. At first it looked like the flu, or sometimes just a bad cold. The moment we saw the swollen black sore on my grandmother's neck, we knew it was something far worse. She collapsed in the kitchen later that night while trying to sip water, and my mother and I carried her unconscious body over to her bed. She was covered in sweat, coughing up blood, her skin turning black as the swollen sores spread throughout her flesh. It seemed like the buboes on her neck, armpits and groin swelled before my eyes, with massive amounts of pus slowly leaking out of tiny holes all over the wounds. The tip of her nose had started to turn black with dark, sickly, purplish splotches all around it. We all knew she would not survive for much longer. I went to my grandmother with a cool cloth. She looked up at me with glistening, tear-streaked eyes, confused and rambling. "Oh, is it time for the harvest already?" she said. "I thought it already came." "Grandma, it's me, Jing," I said. "Jing," she said, squinting her eyes. I saw a trickle of blood running down from one nostril. Taking the cloth, I started to wipe it up, but then she started coughing, bending over double. After a few hacking coughs, she spewed out a trickle of dark, thick blood, spitting it onto the covers. "I'm sorry, Mother. I forgot to tell Father about the lamp oil." She looked above me, staring at something only she could see. She began to cry. As she turned her neck to the side, the swollen, pus-filled bubo burst, the black skin rupturing as dark, stinking fluid spewed forth. "Mother, please, it's me. Take me home," she said, continuing to ramble, staring around the room at people only she could see. I turned and ran, unable to take any more of it. My grandfather had complained of headaches and chills earlier in the day. A few hours after my grandmother, he also collapsed. We found him laying on the threshold of the open door, groaning and moving his arms, reaching out as if for someone to pick him back up. Huge, swollen pustules shone from under his armpits and from the sides of his neck. We put him in another bed. He also quickly became delirious, talking to people who weren't there. As the sun set, I knew they would not survive long. Things had gone from bad to worse when I looked out the window into the night beyond and saw the first Japanese soldiers coming, dressed in white biohazard suits and gas masks that covered every inch of their skin. I heard knocking on the neighbor's door, hard and insistent. I moved the curtain away from the window, peering out, my small heart beating fast. Everyone in the house besides myself was, by that time, showing symptoms of what we then knew without a doubt to be the Black Death. We had heard countless horror stories of the Black Death. With up to 70% of people dying in some areas, it was one of the most feared and horrifying diseases imaginable. Most of the townspeople would have fled that night if they hadn't been vomiting blood as their skin turned black. My mother ran over to me, her face pale and sweaty. She wavered on her feet, looking like she might collapse. Then she took a deep breath, closing her eyes and bracing herself. When she looked stable again, she knelt close to me. "The enemy is outside," she whispered. "We must hide you." I nodded silently. I heard shouting coming from next door. Behind the curtain, I caught glimpses of dozens of men in clean white biohazard suits and gas masks walking calmly and confidently onto our road. After another few seconds, a hard knock sounded at our front door. "Quick!" my mother said, pushing me across the kitchen and towards the oven in the corner. We had a large metal oven back then, in addition to the fireplace. Due to my father's position, we were better off than most of the people in our town. Some still lived in cold, unheated shacks and ate rice and water for every meal. The oven had a flat-top grill and of course used firewood, seeing as this was back in 1941. We didn't have electricity in my parents' home, and neither did my grandparents, as far as I knew. In fact, no house in the area had electricity. She opened the door. The cold interior of the oven had ashes and small pieces of twigs forming a uniform carpet. I sneezed as the cloud of debris swirled around us. "No time for that," my mother hissed as I coughed and choked. "Get inside, child, now!" Without thinking, I began to crawl through the tiny door. I could barely fit inside the oven. She closed the door all the way, locking me in the cramped darkness. Curled into a ball, I felt like a fetus imprisoned in an iron womb. A final bone-rattling pounding on the door started. I heard my mother's footsteps as she rushed away from me. A moment later, I heard the door creak open. "Come, come," Japanese soldiers said in broken Chinese. "You come now." As a child, I was extremely bright. Even as a young girl, my vocabulary was well beyond anyone else in my grade. I had also picked up some Japanese, since we were near the puppet state of Manchuria, a vassal of the Imperial Japanese Empire during World War II. So when the Japanese had finished clearing out the house and stood talking to each other, I understood bits and pieces. "What do we do with these logs?" one asked. I felt confused. "What logs?" "These ones, maybe." I didn't understand everything he said after that, but he kept saying the word fire. Later on, I would find out that the Japanese always referred to human experimentation victims as logs to help dehumanize them, to make it easier to burn or dissect them alive, or to inject them with horrifying biological and chemical weapons agents. As the last of the Japanese left the home, I felt sick to my stomach. Curled inside the oven in the fetal position, I began to cry, giving up all hope that things would turn out okay. Things quickly went from bad to worse when I tried to leave the oven and found the door had latched closed. I was in total darkness inside the oven and barely had room to move. A sense of suffocation began to come over me, a feeling of being buried alive. At first, I whimpered as I kicked against the door with whatever force I could muster. It didn't even seem to shake in its frame. I increasingly became panicked, kicking and punching at it. Then I started to scream for help. "Hello?" I yelled. "I'm stuck. Is anyone out there? Please let me out." I don't know how long this went on for, but it seemed eternal. Suddenly, in the midst of my yelling and kicking, the door flew open and light flooded my eyes. I fell out, gasping as tears streamed down my face. I looked up, expecting to see my mother or maybe a Japanese soldier, but it was neither. 3 gaunt Chinese faces looked down at me, men with guns in torn, dirty clothes. I gaped at them, wondering if they were there to kidnap or murder me. "It's okay, little girl," one said to me, kneeling down and brushing my ash-streaked hair out of my face. "We're partisans. We were on our way to attack the Imperial Japanese and put a stop to their monstrous actions." "Where's your family?" another one asked. I looked up at him, seeing he only had one working eye. From it gleamed compassion and understanding. The other was blinded, covered in a cataract, as white and dead as a corpse. "They took them," I said, crying harder. "They made us sick and then they took them away." "What's your name?" the one-eyed soldier asked. "It's Jing," I said. "Well, Jing, my name is Chen. This is my group. We are meeting up with other partisans in the area, armed men who will protect you. You're safe now." No, we're not," I said. Just listen." And as Chen and I stood in the dark kitchen of an empty town, I told him everything that had happened since I first saw the ceramic bomb falling from the sky. The soldiers did not look happy when I told them about the fleas and what had happened. The two behind Chen had panic in their eyes as I finished the story. "Chen, this means we may all be exposed to this disease now," one said, sweating heavily, his greasy hair sticking up all over his head. Chen did not seem distressed. He looked like the calm eye of the hurricane in the midst of panic. "Whether we were exposed or not," Chen said, "this changes nothing. We will continue with our mission. In fact, this only makes it more pressing. We know where the Japanese took the townspeople. We must put a stop to it." I agreed with Chen, mostly because I hoped they would save my family, especially my mother. I figured it was probably too late for my grandmother and grandfather. A sharp pang of sadness pierced me as I thought about them dying from the plague in some freezing cell, alone and delirious. With my head down, deep in thought, I followed them out into the night. I saw strange fluids littering the roads under the moonlight, dark patches of what looked like blood, intermittently marring the dirt road. They were still wet, contrasting with the bone-dry conditions outside. We left the town, and I followed them down another dirt road. After about an hour of hiking, we came upon it. From the distance, I saw a massive building. It looked rather nice from the outside, and even had a balcony hanging over the front door. Every window had bright light coming out. "It looks like someone might be home," I whispered to Chen. I had walked next to him the entire way. We hadn't talked, as he was afraid of making too much noise. "Regardless, we're going in," he said quietly, looking around for something. A few twigs cracked, and more partisans came walking out of the woods, saluting Chen. Now the entire group of partisans was up to 7. "Okay, let's do it," he said with fury on his face, the desire for bloodshed stamped into every word. "According to our plan, as much as possible. Don't let a single Japanese doctor or soldier survive." The rest of them nodded, and without another word, they began sprinting toward the building, some moving toward the front, while others veered off around the back of the building. Chen turned to me. "I have to go in too," he said sadly, kneeling down before me. "Will you be all right out here by yourself?" I felt shocked. "I want to go help rescue my mother," I responded. "They took everyone from me. I should be involved too." "You're just a little kid who can't use a gun," Chen said reassuringly. "Just stay out here. And if I don't come back within 30 minutes, get out of here. Go find some family you can contact. Anyone at all, a cousin or an uncle. Get away from here. This place is poisoned." He rose, turning. With a last glance around the open field leading to the Unit 731 building, he broke out of the cover of the trees and began running. Gunfire erupted from inside the building, shattering the calming nighttime ambiance. I saw flashes of light erupting out of the windows. It wasn't contained in one spot, but rather seemed spread throughout the building. First, There would be a long, sustained fire from the front of the first floor, then seconds later, another burst from the side of the third floor. And then everything went deathly silent. A man ran out of the front of the building, one of the Chinese partisans. He had lost his gun somewhere and stood covered in blood, his left arm ripped off at the shoulder, spurting great arterial streams out of his body. He tripped over his own foot, tangling his legs together, and landed hard on the wound. Crying and choking, he called for help. No one came. Seconds later, he stopped moving, dying on the ground in front of my eyes. I decided I should go in. I remembered what Chen told me, but I decided he was wrong. This was my family, after all, not his. As quietly as possible, I sprinted past the dead partisan and into the open front door. Bright lights shone all down the hallway, illuminating the gore and splattered blood along the white walls and polished floors. A dismembered arm with its finger still around the trigger lay at the side, discarded like trash. Without another thought, I shook the limb loose and lifted the gun up. Now I would do it, I thought to myself. Now I was just like them. I had a gun, and I was here to save my mother. Nothing would stop me. I spun around, deciding to go deeper into the building when something stopped me. Chen stood there around the next corner, leaning against the wall and bleeding heavily. His scalp looked ripped open, his face a mask of gore. I looked down at his chest, realizing I could see the organs inside. His intestines looked like deep red worms trying to slip out of the ground. He had one hand on the area, trying to keep his organs inside. "You," he said, breathing hard, "need to run." He stumbled, falling to his knees, putting his hand out towards me. "Get out of here now. They're all dead. I found no one." He fell face first on the ground, a spreading pool of blood forming around his body. I walked past him, not believing. I found a stairwell, deciding I should start with the basement. I looked in the first room, seeing stainless tables side by side. On each lay a body. Some were pregnant women, their faces twisted in agony, their stomachs cut open. Fetuses and babies lay next to their mothers, also dissected. Against the back wall, I saw entire babies preserved in glass jars filled with liquids. Next to them, I saw human heads, hearts, livers, and intestines. In disgust, I left, going to the next room. In this one, I saw dozens of burn victims, their bodies blackened into a crisp, some of them also dissected. As I walked past, one of them began breathing, moaning something incomprehensible. I saw fire-blackened fingers twitch as the person tried to raise their hand toward me. Chen had been wrong. Someone was alive. Then I heard the deep, guttural breathing from the hallway behind me. With my heart racing, I turned, raising the gun. An abomination stood there, something from the depths of hell. Sewn together from many body parts, it had 5 legs, the stitches black and ugly against its naked skin. It towered over me, its head scraping the ceiling. I saw the 10 arms sewn onto its long, snake-like chest flexing and clenching. From many of the stitch wounds connecting the limbs to the body, a dark, sickly-smelling fluid dripped down. It had 3 heads on the top, all mutilated, their cheeks sliced open, showing the grinning teeth below. I saw animal and reptilian eyes staring out from the heads, implanted next to human eyes. After a moment of shock, I pulled the trigger. The recoil from the gun was far stronger than I expected, but since the creature was so tall, I still ended up hitting it in the shoulder. It shrieked as black blood began to run down its pale skin, its voices rising together in outrage and pain, its many legs starting to move and scuttle forward. I turned and immediately fell over the body of a Japanese soldier, still dressed in a white biohazard suit. I felt the creature's fingers closing around my ankle when someone yelled from behind me, "Hey, you!" A woman cried loudly. A burst of gunfire rang out. Turning in surprise, I saw my mother standing there with a stolen gun from a Japanese soldier. She had sores from the Black Death all over her skin, and her nose had turned dark from the necrosis. She stumbled forward, firing as she went, until the gun ran out of bullets. I saw blossoms of gore sprouting all over the abomination's body as bullet after bullet tore through it. When the gun finally clicked empty, she threw it aside. Then she jumped on the abomination, biting and clawing at its skin like a rabid animal. I turned and ran, never looking back. After the Japanese infected our towns with the Black Death, the Chinese government came in and walled off the areas. They are still off limits, the area poisoned and dangerous. I had a deoxyribonucleic acid test done later in life, out of curiosity. They told me many interesting things, but one of the most significant was that I have a genetic mutation that causes me to be resistant to the Black Death. It is, I think, the main reason I survived. The horrors I would see after that bomb fell scarred me for the rest of my life. I still remember the sick, sweating people with black pustules the size of eggs, like a baby pushing against its mother's body to get out. I remember the eyes of the women dissected alive, their fetuses ripped out of their bodies, their faces forever expressing eternal horror. None of that will ever leave me. What Unit 731 brought us was hell on earth.